Most people feel safe on a familiar trail. The rhythm of your footsteps on dirt, the crisp breath of fresh morning air, and open skies stretching over pine trees. It is supposed to be the ultimate sanctuary, the one place where the noise, the pressure, and the dangers of the outside world simply cannot reach you. But on a warm July morning in the rugged wilderness of Montana, a world-class young athlete rounded a familiar bend on her daily training run and came face to face with an unbelievable nightmare. What followed was an extraordinary battle of sheer human will against the elements, a community's relentless bravery, and a massive, months-long mountain manhunt that gripped an entire nation. This is the story of Kari Swenson. To understand the absolute shockwaves this case sent through the American public, we first have to look at who Kari Swenson was in the summer of 1984. At just 22 years old, Kari was the perfect definition of discipline, focus, and peak physical strength. She wasn't just a casual jogger. She was one of the premier female biathletes in the United States. The biathlon is widely considered one of the most grueling sports in the world, combining the explosive, high-intensity aerobic output of cross-country skiing with the near-superhuman stillness, breath control, and precision required for rifle shooting. Kari was an elite pioneer in the women's division, having already helped secure a historic bronze medal for the U.S. team at the 1984 World Championships in Chamonix, France. During the off-season, Kari took a summer job at the historic Lone Mountain Ranch in Big Sky, Montana, working in the hospitality department. To maintain her elite lung capacity and lower body endurance for the upcoming winter season, her daily routine centered on long, solitary running sessions through the surrounding Gallatin National Forest. These mountains weren't a source of fear or intimidation to Kari. They were her personal training ground. She knew the layout of the peaks, felt completely at home among the thick lodgepole pines, and ran those isolated backcountry trails with absolute confidence. That deep sense of peace is exactly what made her sudden disappearance so terrifying. While Kari Swenson was competing on the world stage, two men were living a primitive, almost feral existence deep within those very same Montana mountains. Their names were Don Nichols and his 19-year-old son, Dan Nichols. Don Nichols was an eccentric, deeply paranoid man who had grown utterly disillusioned with modern American society. He hated the concept of taxes, government regulations, and the fast-paced nature of modern life. In the mid-1970s, he made a radical, irreversible decision. He abandoned civilization entirely. He took his young son, Dan, away from school and society, and retreated into the absolute isolation of the Montana backwoods. The captors. For nearly a decade, the Nichols men lived completely off the grid as self-styled, modern-day mountain men. They didn't build a permanent cabin that could be spotted from the air. Instead, they moved nomadically between crude, hidden campsites. They slept under canvas tarps, wore handmade clothes from animal hides, and survived entirely on wild game they poached out of season. But years of total isolation, away from any form of normal human contact, had curdled Don Nichols' mind into a dark, possessive fantasy. His son Dan was now an adult, and Don decided the boy needed a wife to help populate their wilderness domain. Rather than allowing Dan to visit a town or interact normally with women, Don devised a terrifyingly primitive solution. They would simply venture down to the public hiking trails, select a healthy young woman by force, and drag her back into the deep woods as a lifetime captive. They began stalking the local trailheads, watching through binoculars from the high ridges, waiting for an isolated target they could easily overpower. On the morning of July 15th, 1984, Kari Swenson finished her morning duties at the ranch, laced up her running shoes, and drove to the Ulysses Lakes trailhead. It was a beautiful, clear summer morning, and she expected a standard, peaceful 2-hour training run before returning to work. She locked her car and jogged confidently up in the mountains, her mind entirely focused on her pace and her breathing. She was several miles into the forest when she rounded a sharp bend in the trail and froze. Standing directly in her path, completely blocking the trail, were two men. They were filthy, unkempt, smelling heavily of camp smoke, and dressed in tattered clothes. But what instantly sent a surge of pure terror through Kari's body was what they were carrying. Both men were armed with high-powered hunting rifles. Kari stopped, trying to speak calmly, assuming they might just be eccentric local hunters. But Don Nichols stepped forward, stating coldly that they were taking her. The moment he reached out to grab her, Kari screamed at the top of her lungs, pivoted, and tried to bolt back down the trail towards safety. But she was no match for the physical force of two desperate men. Don lunged forward, tackling her heavily to the ground. As she fought back wildly, biting, kicking, and screaming, the men pinned her down. Within seconds, Don produced a set of heavy, industrial iron chains and padlocks. They bound her wrists together, padlocked the other end of the chain securely to his son Dan, and dragged her violently off the path. They forced her up the steep, trackless ridges of the mountains, completely erasing any sign of her existence from the main trail. Back at the Lone Mountain Ranch, late afternoon bled into evening. Kari's work shift was scheduled to begin, but her station remained empty. This was instantly a massive warning sign for everyone who knew her. Kari wasn't just reliable. She was a disciplined athlete who operated like clockwork. She would never simply skip a shift. Her friends immediately drove to the trailhead where they knew she had planned to run. There, sitting entirely alone in the fading twilight, was her locked car. Realizing that she was either severely injured or that something far more sinister had occurred, the ranch staff contacted the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department. By nightfall, a massive rescue operation was initiated. The local community deeply loved Kari, and dozens of volunteer woodsmen, ranchers, and tracking experts eagerly stepped forward. Among the volunteers were two close friends of Kari's family, Alan Goldstein, a highly respected local real estate agent and expert outdoorsman, and Jim Schwalb, a seasoned backcountry outfitter. Equipped with high-powered flashlights and firearms, the teams fanned out into the pitch-black wilderness. They moved with incredible speed through the treacherous nighttime terrain, actively looking for bent twigs, disturbed moss, or faint footprints in the dirt. Remarkably, because of their intimate knowledge of the local landscape, Goldstein and Schwalb managed to close the distance far faster than the kidnappers ever anticipated. By the first light of dawn on July 16th, Alan Goldstein and Jim Schwalb were pushing through a heavily obscured, dense thicket of pine trees on a remote ridge when they suddenly stumbled directly into a small clearing. There, completely blindsided, were Don and Dan Nichols. Kari Swenson was right beside them, chained securely to a large tree, trunk like an animal. Alan Goldstein instantly raised his weapon and shouted at the men to drop their rifles and put their hands in the air. But instead of surrendering, absolute panic and chaos erupted within the campsite. Don Nichols screamed at his son to shoot. In the terrifying confusion of the moment, the 19-year-old Dan Nichols panicked, swung his rifle toward Kari, and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The high-velocity bullet tore directly into Kari's chest, fracturing her ribs, puncturing her lung, and exiting through her back. She collapsed into the dirt, coughing up blood in agonizing pain. Hearing the gunshot, Alan Goldstein moved forward to protect her, but Don Nichols stepped out from behind a tree, aimed his rifle, and shot Goldstein squarely in the face. Alan died instantly, falling to the forest floor. Jim Schwalb, realizing they were completely outgunned and caught in a deadly ambush, managed to dive backward into the thick brush as Don fired several more rounds at him. With one rescuer dead and another fleeing to get help, the Nichols men realized their location was totally compromised. They quickly used their keys to unchain Kari from the tree, leaving her bleeding profusely on the cold ground, and vanished like ghosts into the dense wilderness. Kari was left entirely alone, fighting a desperate, solitary battle for every single breath for over 4 agonizing hours, wondering if help would ever return. When a second, heavily armed rescue team finally navigated their way back to the bloody clearing, guided by a traumatized Jim Schwalb, they expected to find 2 bodies. But Kari Swenson was an elite athlete with an extraordinarily strong cardiovascular system. Despite a completely collapsed lung and massive internal bleeding, Her elite physical conditioning kept her body from sliding into fatal shock. She had spent those 4 hours applying manual pressure to her own chest wound, using the breathing exercises from her biathlon training to stay calm and conscious. The rescue team worked frantically to stabilize her. She was carefully carried down the rugged mountain face on a stretcher, loaded into a medical helicopter, and flown to the nearest trauma hospital. The surgeons who operated on her were completely stunned by what they saw. The bullet had ripped entirely through her chest cavity, but by a matter of mere millimeters, it had miraculously bypassed her spine, her heart, and her major aorta artery. Her physical resilience was nothing short of legendary. Defying every medical expectation, just 8 days after taking a rifle round directly to the chest, Kari Swenson stood up and walked out of the hospital on her own 2 feet. She was alive, and her spirit was completely unbroken, but the state of Montana was now demanding justice. The murder of Alan Goldstein and the kidnapping of an international sports star instantly turned the case into a massive national news story. The FBI joined forces with local sheriff's departments to launch one of the largest, most difficult manhunts in the history of the American West. But catching Don and Dan Nichols inside their own domain was an administrative nightmare. The father and son had spent a decade treating these mountains like their personal backyard. They knew every hidden cave, every untraceable rocky ridge, and every natural water source. They didn't use credit cards, didn't have social security numbers, and didn't communicate with any family members in the outside world. The manhunt dragged on for months, stretching from the warm days of summer into the freezing depths of the Montana winter. Bloodhounds, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, and teams of elite tactical officers scoured the mountains. But the suspects consistently stayed one step ahead, hiding in underground bunkers and surviving on caches of food they had buried years prior. The breakthrough finally came in December of 1984, roughly 5 months after the ambush. A local cowboy checking on cattle near the small town of Norris, Montana, noticed a faint wisp of smoke rising from a snowy, isolated canyon where no one should have been. He contacted the authorities. A heavily armed tactical unit completely surrounded the camp in the dead of night. Frozen, exhausted, and completely cut off from any escape route, Don and Dan Nichols finally realized their run was over. They stepped out of their tent and surrendered to the waiting deputies without firing a single shot. The subsequent trials held in Bozeman, Montana, fascinated the entire nation, exposing the dark, violent reality behind the romanticized myth of the rugged American mountain man. The father and son were tried separately for their roles in the crimes. Dan Nichols, the son, was found guilty of kidnapping and misdemeanor assault, with the jury taking into account the intense psychological manipulation and abuse he suffered under his authoritarian father. He was sentenced to 20 years in state prison and was eventually paroled in 2001. Don Nichols, however, faced the absolute full weight of the justice system. The prosecution painted him as a dangerous, calculating predator who brought terror to an innocent community and stole the life of a brave volunteer rescuer. He was convicted of kidnapping, aggravated assault, and the deliberate homicide of Alan Goldstein. The judge sentenced him to a staggering 115 years behind bars without the possibility of an early release, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his natural life in a maximum security prison cell, far away from the wilderness he cherished. But the true hero of this story remains Kari Swenson. She refused to let those 5 hours of terror define the rest of her life. She underwent an intensive, painful rehabilitation process to rebuild her damaged lung capacity. In an incredible display of human resilience, she returned to competitive biathlon training, made the U.S. national team once again, and went on to win prestigious competitions, proving that the human spirit can overcome even the darkest monsters hidden in the woods. The case of Kari Swenson stands as a powerful, timeless warning about how quickly a peaceful morning can transform into a terrifying battle for survival. It highlights the incredible bravery of a community that refused to let one of their own disappear, and the indomitable will of a woman who simply refused to die. If this story of survival and justice deeply moved you, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comment section below. We bring you deeply researched true crime stories every single week. Thank you for tuning in, and stay safe out there on the trails.